Okay, pushed. Yeah.
Okay. So this is the real cold open right here. Now that you're actually recording. So this is the second take of an impromptu sort of introduction to something fun we did earlier this week.
Oh wait, so we're just literally doing this again.
I mean, I don't know. What are our options?
Yeah, exactly. Well, we do have something very special to share with you guys.
Yeah. Well, we recorded with Andrew Sullivan earlier this week.
You may have heard of him.
You may have heard of this guy. Yeah, I mean, Shadi, you've been reading him from early days. I've been, well, slightly less early days for me because I'm a little older than you, but still, just an incredibly influential, path-breaking character, Andrew Sullivan, and a really sort of a force of nature in writing, I'd say, right?
Yes, yes, and we did something we've never done before, and Andrew was a part of it. We did a simulcast, and that's what we're about to present to you guys. So basically, the idea there is you join forces with another podcast, and it's sort of like, I guess, co-branded, but then each podcast releases it on the same day, which I guess will be in the future for you, but in the present, wait, no. Okay,
No, the other
see,
way
this
around.
is this is where time gets very confusing. The
Yeah,
past
there's like
is the present.
yeah, there's like a novel you could write about this. I feel.
A meta
Maybe it could be your
novel,
first
yeah.
novel, the meta novel, yeah, about Time's Arrow, I think, or something like that.
So I think I really enjoyed the conversation. Andrew's a great guy to hang out with and just talk about things with. And what we wanted to do here, I think, was to talk about a couple things we disagree on and to tease them out in a friendly, informal way and try to drill down on where those disagreements come from and what are the different starting premises that color our arguments on questions around whether Trump is an existential threat or whether he was, and maybe that's part of the debate. Was he? Is he? Will he continue being so? But also to have broader conversations about the nature of democracy and how democracies survive over time in deeply polarized contexts. We covered a lot of ground, and you'll see where we disagree. And I think it was useful for me to kind of talk through some of this, and I hope it was for you, Demir, as well, and I hope it was for Andrew, and you all will get a chance to listen to that full conversation unedited, I think, really. So really, this is what we did, and you'll be a part of it.
Yep. In any case, I'm gonna take your role, Shadi, and just encourage our dear listeners, if they're not paying subscribers, to become one by going to www. Wait, no, there's no www. Wisdomofcrowds.live /subscribe. Give us a little bit of money and get access to bonus episodes, one of which we will record right after we finish recording this intro. And other member-only essays and things that I think going forward we'll be doing more and more of. In any case, Shadi, I hope when you listen to this the second, the first time, you'll enjoy it as well. I've already listened to it, and it's
Oh
quite
wow,
good.
you already know exactly what happened.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay,
All
great.
right.
Well, hope you guys enjoy it. Thank you for listening to Wisdom of Crowds.
Welcome to the latest Dishcast. Thanks so much for listening. We're getting more and more viewers and listeners, or listeners mainly. And that's really encouraging. The whole thing has been extraordinarily encouraging. I'm here today with Shadi Hamid. Jesus, I don't even have your. Why did you give your quick, as they say in these like seminars? You give us your pronouns and then give us your just a little bit of who you are, in case people don't know who you are.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having us, Andrew. Good to be with you. I am one of the two co-hosts of the Wisdom of Crowds podcast, along with my illustrious friend, Demir Marushik, who's also here, but he's He's being beamed in from Croatia, where he is now, so he can say something in a moment. But I'm Shadi. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and I work quite a bit on the role of religion in public life, specifically Islam, but also more broadly. So I'm, very interested in the questions of identity, culture, why we believe the things that we believe. And what we try to do on our podcast is try to drill down to the starting premises. If we disagree, which I think, most people disagree about some things, what causes us to disagree?
Uh-huh. Damir, do you want to say something? You're sitting there in this rather elaborate ballroom in Croatia with a large chandelier and in Zagreb.
In Zagreb, yes. Hi, Andrew.
Hi,
good to see
Damir.
you.
Nice to meet you properly.
Nice to meet you, and Shadi, good to see you. Well, even though you're sort of off screen for me here. Yeah, I'm basically Shadi's friend. I'm at the Atlantic Council. I do Europe stuff there. Before that, I was executive editor at the American Interest magazine, which is now shut down.
Was that with was that Frank Fukuyama's outfit?
That was Frank Fukuyama's thing. Yeah, it was Frank's.
And he has a new thing, right? He has a new.
He does have a new thing. Yeah, it's called The American Purpose.
Right.
It's quite good. Good stuff there as well. Yeah, and I mean, that's basically what Shadi said. The story is basically, I think Shadi and I were arguing on a bus with Meghan McArdle present, and she
in
turned to
Israel,
us at
we
one
should
point.
say.
In Israel, in
Israel?
fact.
Believe it or not, very controversial. No,
And
well,
Meghan
Big on a
turned to us
bus
and
in
said,
Israel. It's usually, was it one of those Egged buses? Is that what they call them? Egged?
wait, what's that?
I don't know. I remember when I was in Israel, there were all these
Special Israeli bus?
Well, it looked like a special Israeli
Yeah.
bus. It had lots of special Israelis in there with lots of chest hair poking up above their. Anyway, let's
That's
not go
one thing
into
we
my.
have in common, Arabs and Israelis. I mean, we chest hair is definitely prominent.
It is. I went there on a high school trip to the Holy Land at the age of 14 and was a little taken aback by how beautiful all the men were. And of course, was completely unable to express any of this stuff and walked around like a fucking tent pole the entire week, could barely contain myself. So that's, I was a Zionist from that moment on, if only for the chest and back hair.
Well, it's interesting that we there was actually I don't know if an effort to cancel me per se, but I was attacked a lot for even visiting Israel on that particular trip, that I was breaking BDS, and I should have been, as an Arab and a Muslim, participating in the boycott, which meant kind of no interaction with Israeli institutions or interlocutors. That's actually a thing. Yeah.
Really? You can't even go to regular Israel? I'm not talking about the occupied territory.
No.
I'm talking about regular Israel. You can't go there and hang out?
Not really.
well, Andrew, don't forget the other thing. It's really important that you remember Shadi is a man of the left. And so all these things apply double to him. So he's a leftist Muslim.
He's not
or
a
at least
man
he
of the left.
No, I know.
No, ask him. He is. He does. He thinks so. He thinks he is.
You're skeptical about that?
Well, you don't feel that way to me. But I think that's because the left now feels such a constrictive and tedious and banal and moralistic and nagging place. And I don't associate any of those adjectives with you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
It's just a sensibility. I mean, I used to love lefties and arguments and fights and debates, and it was always amusing. I grew up talking about the bus. I'm now completely getting off topic, but I used to spend my entire childhood and adolescence having a fight on a bus. As a kid, because I took, this is a true story, I promise you, I took the same bus to school every day as Keir Starmer, who's now the leader of the Labour Party and the leader of the opposition in Britain. And we fought every day. I was a Thatcherite. He at that point was some Euro communist or something. And we just had it out every day for 7 years, including in our in the actual school itself. And I love debates on buses. And you were with Meghan.
Yeah, and a few other people too. And I think Glenn Lowry was there for part of it
So
as
this
well.
was some sort of evil neocon summit
a
in Israel?
Christian group.
It was a Christian
Believe
group?
it or not, yeah. That's part of what was controversial. Supposedly
Evangelicals?
kind of evangelical. Yeah.
Damir, you were there? Yes, you were there, obviously. So were these, you were surrounded, but you were paid for by neoconservative evangelicals who
No,
think
that's
that-
right. That's right. That's exactly right. It was my first time there as well. Not for Shadi. I don't know if Shadi had been there before. Certainly my first time in Israel. And and basically I was arguing with Shadi about something. I don't know what, doesn't matter. But Megan told us to start a podcast. And that's how we started the podcast, basically.
Oh, great.
Right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because we kept
Yeah.
them just sort of like in the back of the bus. Me and Demir, in a very natural way, we just kept on like going back and forth. And Megan was like, "Hey, why don't you guys just try to just make this into something?" And then we decided to take it seriously.
She was just listening.
She took part a little bit.
No. She was, and actually, our greatest sin so far, and really the plan was to have her on, and we still haven't. So I think we need to rectify that. Hopefully before the year is over, but if not, like way before that, because actually, she both helped found it. And actually, we spent a lot of time on the trip talking to her, so I think it'll make for an excellent episode.
She's fantastic. She's like
she's great.
Twice your height, Shadi. I think
she is a bit tall. Yeah, that's true.
She's like this ant, but incredibly a lovely person. And we've been old friends back when she was like just this sort of sprightly libertarian, along with Dave Weigel.
Yeah, Dave Weigel. Yeah,
who also came out of that Reason world. Actually,
that's right.
Well, anyway, nice to see you guys.
Likewise, yeah. And this is the first time we've ever done a simulcast ourselves, so really happy to be doing it with you, Andrew. Yeah,
thank you. Well, why not? I realize it's kind of easy. You just do podcasts with other podcasters, and you all get around and chat with each other. But it's true also that people that are doing podcasts tend to be kind of interesting characters. And I wanted to talk today about what we're going through as a democracy, and really maybe talk to you both about the last 4 years. I mean, what does this really mean? Have some of us got it wrong? Did I overreact to what seemed to be deeply illiberal and worrying forces in the society and in this particular individual who became president of the United States? And the current debate about whether what we're now enduring, which is another unique thing in American history, which is a losing candidate and sitting president commanding vast crowds, declaring that he won the election by a large amount and that the president-elect is not the president-elect. And we've also had, obviously, countless, well, how many we have now? Like 40 to 50 lawsuits that have been, and I think only one minor one has been admitted. But also, a huge majority of, not a huge majority, but a substantial majority of the voters for one of the two major parties believes this election was illegitimate, which is in itself, I think, an extraordinary crisis. I think it's worse than what happened after Trump himself was elected, although I really don't think we should let people off the hook who behaved appallingly after that in doubting the legitimacy of that election. Now, I'm on more of the world is falling, the sky is falling than you are. Tell me, either of you, we'll start with Damir, maybe. Why am I being a hysteric? What are the major reasons why I am being a total drama queen about this?
I don't know. I wouldn't characterize you as that. I guess the question for me is, I mean, let's sort of start unpacking basically where I think we are at this point, and maybe just sort of jumping off from what you said. I do think that this is exceedingly bad, the situation we find ourselves in now, and yeah, as you said, I think that there's plenty of bad behavior on the fact of how the resistance was resisting Trump, but I'm not really interested in doing both sidesism on this. I think that in and of itself also doesn't really get us anywhere. I guess my sort of jumping off point for thinking about all of this stuff, and it's something that like Shadi and I have talked about in the podcast in the last year and a half, as we've done it. I've written about it on the podcast website as well. Is and this might be just sort of like a failing of my own. Like I don't know if I think of it as a sort of analytical pose that's powerful and important, but I think it creates blind spots for myself as well. And that is to sort of take a step back and say, take an even broader sort of systemic look at things and try and get a grip of what things are. And that comes off a little bit, I think, as perhaps uh, too distanced and too, well, quite frankly, I get criticized for being too both sidesy on that by saying that, well, there was bad behavior leading up to this, and in fact that the decline of a democracy ends up being the result of a complex factor of sides interacting and sort of feeding off each other into this toxicity. Um, and I think that's where we're seeing right now, ultimately. Does that mean that the Democrats are equally to blame for where we're at? In fact, no. No, not at all. I wouldn't say that at all. Um, I do think, though, that where we are right now, Andrew, and I think I take all your points that, especially, since the election, the fact that this clown emperor of ours keeps doing what he's doing, and the kind of sort of, I think, damage that this is doing to the body politic is real and profound. Um, I remain convinced that honestly, the way that Biden is going about this is the correct way. It's the only way, which is basically he's won. He is behaving as if he's won. He is largely, just going about the business of becoming president of this. Um, and we can talk about the last 4 years and what this moment means, but from my pose, and it's the pose I end up taking at this sort of like distance posed from the whole thing, is where do we go from here? And it seems to me that the only thing that we can do as a democracy is to take stock of what it is, and we need to get back to the habits of a transition of power and getting onto it. Again, I'm happy to spend a good time unpacking how this could possibly play out in the worst possible ways. But I just want to sort of, as a jumping off point, say that I do think that what Biden's doing right now, and that whole sort of aspect of it, that sort of relegates, admittedly, a large chunk of the population and one of the two major parties as a bit of a clown sideshow, is the right and correct way to move forward.
Shadi?
Yeah, I mean, so I used to think that the sky was falling. So when Trump was running in 2016 during the campaign, I remember being pretty freaked out. And it's worth remembering just how crazy, and I don't even mean crazy like the stuff we've seen like the last couple of years, but stuff that went well beyond that. So, for example, refusing to condemn the internment of Japanese Americans, talking about maybe doing ID cards for American Muslims. He said something like, "I think Islam hates us." So, as an American Muslim, I was thinking about worst case scenarios. I mean, this is someone who seems to have a particular and somewhat unusual dislike of the group of which I am a part, or one of the groups of which I am a part. Um, and then when he was actually elected, I think I was able to sort of reorient myself and chill. And maybe chilling can be too much of a problem. You don't want to be too chill because that can sometimes make you complacent, of course. But I think that what I've seen the past 4 years, the worst case scenarios did not happen, that American democracy proved to be quite resilient. And this was a hard test. And this is how we judge democracies. How do they react and how do they persist when they're faced with an exogenous shock, something which they've never really seen before? We've had shocks for sure, but we've never had someone quite like Donald Trump. And he, I think, has tested the system and tried to push as hard as he can. What he's found is that our system pushes back, and we do have veto points in our government. We do have institutions that are strong and somewhat autonomous, that don't actually buckle at what the executive is doing, and so on and so forth. So I think that's where I draw some level of inspiration that it could have been really bad, and we have to remember. So a lot of this is relevant.
Here's what I want to know: where did he fail? What did he try to do that he was prevented from doing? by the institutions, by the checks? Because I don't see anything.
You mean you don't see that he tried, or you don't?
I don't see where he was actually checkmated.
Oh, where he was checked. Okay.
By, for example, the Congress, which is, was elected the opposite party after 2 years and huge amounts of scandal and stuff to investigate. And they did. And they even went to the lengths of impeachment. The man never had a single member of his administration testify before them. He acted as an executive completely above and beyond any congressional testimony. He defied subpoenas. He defied any lawsuits. He challenged back. He sued back. We never got his tax returns. We don't have a single thing on this guy. He was able to turn what was a pretty damning report by Bob Mueller. I mean, not anything like the crazy conspiracy theories that were drummed up before, but nonetheless, and I think that was part of the problem. But if you didn't have that, oh, he's an agent of Moscow situation, and you just looked at what he'd been doing, including his first attempt to rig this election by getting a foreign government to smear Biden, I just don't see a single moment when he was actually stopped from doing something he really tried to do. Now, you can say he didn't get some things done, like the wall, for example, but he never really tried to fund it. I mean, he could have done those first 2 years and really didn't. It was his fault, not the Democrats. So I see that nothing stood in his way whatsoever.
Well, so when I look at the worst things that Trump has done the past 4 years, I those things to me are the things that a conventional Republican president would have done. When you actually look at
Invent a national emergency in order to shift funds from the Congress to pay for something that he wanted, the Congress didn't. Name another Republican president who's got away with that.
No, but like when we look at what actually hurts people in discrete policy terms, it's things like breaking up families when it comes to immigration at the borders, or and that's something, for example, that any other Republican president, Ted Cruz or whoever else, might have done in a similar way, pushing really hard and perhaps doing it more competently. So when we, or whatever the tax cuts, for example, or mismanaging the economy, or not addressing inequality in any kind of way, or reversing.
Sure, I mean, I'm not talking about policy agenda in a way, because in some ways I think policy is a bit irrelevant to all of this, because much of what he did turns out to be rather conventional Republican policy. I mean, massive tax cuts that are basically paid for by borrowing to keep the economy moving. And he did deregulate stuff that in a way. What I'm getting at is constitutionally, as the executive branch, he ran this country as if there were no Congress, as if there were no opposition whatsoever, no institutional checks, regardless. He was not checked, really. I mean, in some cases with immigration courts, I think they overstepped, but they did try and check a few things along the way, and he kept going. But by and large, he got away with it. And not only that, but you can see as he was rebuilding his case for re-election that I think without COVID, he would have won quite handily. After which, having proven that he is immune to any congressional checking, and almost to most of the courts that he obeyed were in trivial matters, but on fundamental matters like accountability, he got away with absolutely everything and was about to get away with far more. I mean, I think the system catastrophically failed.
That's a different perspective, I think.
But tell me where I'm wrong.
Andrew, which are you most concerned? Because I'm still, fair, everything you listed, except what's the lasting legacy of this? That these are new norms and paths that have been set. Do you think a future? Do you think a future Republican or Democratic, charismatic? You need a certainly charismatic leader to hold one's party in thrall like that. Correct? Right? I mean, that's one thing. In some ways, there's that element of Trump. I mean, he is kind of sui generis in that way, right? And I mean, what again? Just drill in for me. You're concerned about like the precedents, the precedents that he successfully set? I completely agree. We got lucky because of COVID. Because I do think in the second term he's figured out the monkey that he is, where most of the levers are in the machine room. And, I think he'd be more deft at pulling them and much clearer in his own mind what he can and can't get away with. But ultimately, it's to restate Shadi's point to in a different sort of way. Um, the fact is that the Republican Party, to a certain extent, was powerless before its voters that whom he had managed to mobilize behind his personality. But also, they were getting a lot of the stuff that they wanted out of him from the policy thing. And again, so again, drill in for me exactly your concern. Is it the norm breaking, or is it that it's just been revealed to all of us that presidents are largely unconstrained because he's figured some stuff out that's been sitting there forever? Really,
Yes.
is another way to look at it. So I
Yes.
don't know. Unpack that for me a little bit.
Well, here's what I would say, that over the last, especially 50 years, maybe 70 years since the Second World War, the executive branch has become extraordinarily more powerful than it ever was previously, certainly not anything before the 20th century. Now it's almost unrecognizable in terms of its power and its authority. Everybody looks to the president. The Congress is almost irrelevant. They've kind of surrendered a huge amount of their powers. So this guy comes along with that legacy. I mean, just look at what Bush and Cheney managed to do to American civil liberties, and does something else, which is he creates a mass movement, an extraordinarily potent, powerful, right populist mass movement that is dedicated to him more than anything else. Him. It's not really a set of policies. It's a set of attitudes and prejudices and feelings, some of which are completely legitimate and justified in many ways by the way elites have mismanaged this country. But nonetheless, that's what he did. So we then had this sort of Eric Hoffer moment where we don't really have a Republican Party. It's over. It's disappeared as a party. It doesn't really have any institutional power except insofar as he has energized it into a mass movement. So it's no longer a functioning political party as we would understand it. It's a mass movement that seized power. Narrowly, but nonetheless, that's all you need. He got in. And with that, was able to command the entire Republican Party, Senate and House, was able to fill the judiciary with people whose one common characteristic was complete deference to executive power and a belief that the judiciary should really not really have a role in checking congressional laws or especially executive pronouncements. And then was attempted to be checked by a midterm election, which is what normally did. And we've showed that the Congress is absolutely incapable of enforcing its subpoenas, its testimony, its powers to push the presidency back. Just countersue, just refuse to cooperate, just tell everyone in your administration you can't appear before the Congress. This has also never happened in modern times. So he proves that you can't impeach a president. If you have a mass movement, you can take over a political party. And if you can then abuse the system so that you just simply borrow money to fuel the economy, you can win yourself re-election.
Well, I mean, there was strong counteraction. I mean, there was an impeachment process. There was the Mueller investigation. There were things that were hobbling Trump for much of his 4 years in office in terms of Democrats highlighting his abuses. And then it's up to the American people and their elected representatives to decide what they want to do with that. But there was no shortage of holding Trump to account. Look at the media. I mean, the entire mainstream media has been, I would say, somewhat obsessively going too far in becoming just everything is anti-Trump. Some of that is useful in that it does provide a check, that you had a very vigorous media. You did have a vigorous Democrats pushing hard back against Donald Trump, perhaps too hard. And I would say one thing that I was uncomfortable was the tendency sometimes to delegitimize the election results after the fact. And this wasn't just a fringe thing. As recently as 2019, Hillary Clinton was still saying that the election was, quote unquote, stolen from her. Harry Reid, former Senate Majority Leader, actually suggested that the Russians might have tampered with the vote tallies in 2016. And again, I want to make sure that I want to be clear that I think what Republicans are doing now is significantly worse than what Democrats did after Trump was elected. They are not equivalent, but I think it is also worth noting that the tendency to not see the other side as legitimate is becoming a bipartisan thing.
I agree. I'm not going to disagree with that at all, but that I think I'm trying to use that evidence to strengthen my point, which is you could have a massive opposition. You could have intense press hostility. You could have a Congress elected in the midterms deliberately and quite clearly to hold him to account. Got nowhere. And he could have easily, apart from this little thing in the air, he could have won re-election, also having attempted to use his foreign policy powers to target his political enemy. And every time he won, which is every time, he was emboldened. And the greater the rhetorical overkill that he engaged in, and the less legitimate the mainstream media and liberal institutions became with respect to the general public, including critical institutions like the FBI and the CIA. We had a president saying these institutions are illegitimate. They're after you. They're being run by a conspiracy against you, and did not lose much support in his own mass movement for saying those things. Demir, you were going to cut in.
No. Here's the thing with what's here's where perhaps I disagree with Shadi.
No, Demir, you're not allowed to do that.
And maybe I agree with you, Andrew, but I still think that maybe the difference is in how one approaches this. I think Shadi is a self-described democratic minimalist, and I'll let him talk about that, what that means and the implications of that. But I think that a different way to think about what you're talking about, Andrew, is that America actually has been in democratic decline for a while. And the reason that, just as you were talking right now, I remembered an interesting, not an episode, it's an article that we ran in the American Interest in 2013. I just looked it up. It was by Francis Fukuyama, so second term Obama. I think he just finished his second volume of his 2-volume like magnum opus or whatever, and it was sort of like a summary document of that. And the gist of the second volume is about basically it's about modern state building, how the modern democratic state and the United States came to be as part of this sort of cross. You tried to write a global history in any case. And I remember, so 2013, he's reasonably supportive of Obama. I think he was largely felt that was a good presidency. And the frustration's really showing in that article. And he calls it that, our democracy has become sclerotic in a lot of ways, unmanageable. Too many choke points, he was saying in 2013. Like, actually, nothing can be done in our democracy. And so, at the end, as you do in these sort of papers and sort of stuffy policy journals, you have to have a sort of, and therefore we should. But he did actually a really good job sort of subverting that honorable DC tradition. And he said, well, ideally, perhaps we should have something closer to a parliamentary system and not two monolithic parties. And then these things could perhaps work themselves out. But then he says, of course, where it's America, the Constitution's a quasi-religious document for us. And so the last words are, so we have a problem. But consider, in 2013, before Trump, the main frustration was that there were not enough choke points. No sense that anything like Trump was about to happen. And here comes this guy, and basically does exactly what you described through the force of his personality, creates this kind of transforms a party into a mass movement that is focused on the individual. And yeah, I think as we talk about what happens next after this, perhaps you're right. Perhaps the Republican Party is now basically can't exist outside of him. I'm open to that. And what does that mean for us then? What does that mean for us as Americans? What does it mean for the country if one of two major parties in a presidential system that tends to settle into a two-party system? What does it mean that there has not been that it's been unable to reform one of those two parties? I mean, I guess one could be cautiously, hesitantly, if not optimistic, careful about pronouncing the death of the Republican Party, or at least like the the fact that Trump has somehow barnacle-like attached himself to the party and won't be pried off in any way. But I think it's perfectly plausible to read the last 4 years as an important spasm in what is democratic decline for the United States. I don't know.
Yes. I think I don't really think that we live in a liberal democracy anymore, in many respects. I think he's succeeded and nearly succeeded more. Let me put this scenario. What we also know is that in the last year or so, emboldened by being able to ignore the Congress and to some extent the courts, he clearly decided that he was going to get reelected. And he clearly decided he was going to get reelected whether he won the majority of votes or not. Now, his first attempt was to abuse his power with the Ukraine stuff and Biden to try and get them to smear him. And then we also have this astonishing fact that he paved the way throughout this last year of delegitimizing the results of this election and of all mail-in ballots. He is subsequently, he refused to concede. He is consistently from the White House itself saying that he actually won by a landslide, that only 26 members of his party in the Congress will publicly tell a newspaper that Biden won the election, which is pretty staggering. He has also personally called the legislatures in Pennsylvania, Georgia, and where's the other state that he's anyway, I'm blanking on the third one, to ask them to get the state legislatures to overturn the electors. There is a point at which they can do this, to send electors to the Electoral College from those states that will vote for him rather than for Biden. Now, given his institutional clout, given the fact the party is him at some point, the fact that that has not been done is you're right. That's a relief. That the three of these Republican governors or secretaries of state have actually stood up and said, "We just can't do this." But he asked, and he'll continue to ask. Is this not an attempt to establish one-man rule? And hasn't he pushed it to a level which shocks you?
But doesn't it tell us something that he's trying, but it keeps on being resisted despite the fact that he dominates this party, that you do have Republicans on the local and state level who are not going to rig the vote, because, I mean, the tallies are the tallies and there's only so much you can do, and they're going to be certified. So everything that Trump is trying to do, I would say somewhat half-heartedly and somewhat performatively. I don't know if he really wants to be a dictator, but regardless of what his intents.
You don't have to want to be a dictator to be incapable of accepting any other actor in the system telling you what to do or checking your powers. That's all he has. He's not sitting back having studied the history of dictators and figured out how to take over the country. He is just psychologically incapable of accepting any authority other than himself.
But the point is, he can't do the things that he supposedly wants to do. And I think also, when you look at how the certification process works, and that we have a very clear set of institutional mechanisms for deciding who the president is, technically, Donald Trump does not need to concede for the inevitable reality that Joe Biden will be our president in January. So that to me tells us that if we have someone like Trump in the future who's as charismatic, which is probably unlikely, but it's possible, someone like that again, the system can be counted on, and you can't really alter the result. Now, that's obviously a low bar. All I'm saying is that people were talking about how American democracy was dying for much of the last 4 years, and you had a number of leading scholars writing books about the impending fascism that was upon us. Very alarmist type stuff. And I think at some point we have to look at the empirical record 4 years later and say, okay, well, if American democracy was already dead or it was dying, and people were warning about like a Mussolini moment and all this kind of very, I think, problematic rhetoric, comparing us with, say, I don't know, Nazi era Germany and so on, I mean, shouldn't there be some accountability for the people? And you've spoken out against using the term fascist as you did in your Weimar piece. Um, but like, shouldn't we be able to say like, look, it's been bad, but the people who were saying this was the end, no, we're gonna have another chance, and the experiment will continue. And we shouldn't use words like fascism in this kind of unaccountable, overheated way, because that contributes to a raising of the stakes. And as bad as the Republican Party is quite bad and rotten and corrupt, but and we only have two parties, so at some point it's Democrats who have to kind of take a step back from this endless mutual polarization. And that's a chance that we'll have in the next 4 years. And that's why, like as Demir said, I'm relieved that we have a president who doesn't engage in that rhetoric of endless polarization, of demonizing the other. I mean, that's what we need now. And hopefully we can stop this sort of like endless cycle.
My point is simply look
Yeah.
how close it got. Look what this guy was able to attempt to do.
Yeah.
Someone who really an attack on the very basic legitimacy of our elections in a way that foreign powers attempted to legitimize our elections for many years. He has done this. And we escaped the worst by the skin of our teeth. This is a man who's clearly openly dictatorial, authoritarian. And you look at the election, the Republican Party did, I don't know, pretty solidly. I mean, a very large turnout of very engaged voters, gaining seats in the House, I think probably almost certainly holding the Senate. I mean, when I think of any other contemporary modern democracy, there isn't a single precedent for this since the Second World War. Am I wrong?
Well, what about the case of...
Can you give me another example of a Western democracy where someone has lost the election and insists that it's a fraud and his entire party agrees with him?
It's unusual, to be fair. You're definitely right about that.
No, unprecedented.
Yes.
A disgrace, right?
It's
Something that
definitely-
we should be ashamed of. This is the kind of activity that happens in a developing country, in an unsteady democracy. That in some ways, what I think we learn is that our institutions have failed. They have, or if they have succeeded, they've succeeded by the skin of their teeth. And we have seen in America a huge number of people, basically almost half the country, endorse it, believe in it, support it. There is no big popular understanding or defense of democratic processes or we all took it for granted. It's not there at all. One guy comes along with enough charisma, with enough ability to press certain buttons and pull certain levers, which anybody can do in a democracy. And we came this close to the whole thing falling apart. Even now, I think it's not clear that we'll have an election day, an inauguration day, where Trump may be flying out of the White House to have a mass rally to compete with the inauguration of Joe Biden. I mean, I don't know why you guys are complacent about this.
Well, perhaps Demir's less complacent.
Well,
but
let's get Demir in, because I don't mean to. I've been blathering and go on, Demir.
So here's the thing. I'm perfectly happy to grant you all that, like every last bit of it. But the question then is, I guess what I'm always reacting to on this, and this is what I was getting at, my sort of, what I first said is, and as maybe it's a shortcoming of my own about how I approach these things, but my difference with you, Andrew, is that I can grant you all of this and say, and then my question is, and then where does this leave us? Let's now think clearly about where we are as a country, because I'll just reframe one thing to you. I mean, fair point. We didn't know that our institutions were this, weak. Well, yeah, I guess not. At the same time, most people, I remember reading several articles at the beginning of the Trump era saying, in fact, hey guys, let's not forget, in fact, most of our guardrails are in fact completely norm-based, not written down. The Constitution doesn't make any provisions for this. We have like our entire system is based on this kind of sense of tradition that is very fragile. So in a sense, yeah, we didn't think that something like this could happen. I want to just get you to talk to me a little bit about exactly the implications of what you're saying and the implications of of your despair. And I'm not saying that you don't have a right to despair, but I want you to work through it with me. And it's the following. It's the question of exactly what you said. What does it mean that the Republicans did as well as they did? That they did as well as they did with supposedly, we don't know yet, I guess, because these are still somewhat hazy, but the exit polls are coming into to focus a little bit. And the bump with Hispanics is real. I forget, Shadi, you have some statistic about number of Muslims that voted for Trump as
Yeah.
well. I mean, these things are real. Now, whether that is that a sign of democracy that is just not working, that is completely messed up because all these people have fallen into the cult, or is it that perhaps it's functioning reasonably well still, and there's this like sideshow going on? I don't know, and I again, I want to stress to you, Andrew, that I'm quite open to the idea that we're in a much worse place than we are. But I then want to talk about, and what now? Because um because the question is basically, we need to be looking forward to what does our democracy look like. I can tell you, I said this on the last episode with Shadi, sitting here in Europe now, being distant from all of this, and seeing the sort of Trump eruptions appear in my Twitter feed, and now increasingly less and less on the front page of the newspapers. It is embarrassing. It's an embarrassment. That's exactly the right feeling when you're especially when you're far away from America, watching it from afar. It's shameful, and that this is happening. You're right. It's unprecedented. But I to me, the interesting debate right now, the interesting question is, what does our democracy look like going forward? Yeah, this question of the party, is yeah, Trump will probably run in 2024. Question whether he'll live that long. He's an old fat man. All these sorts of things can intervene between now and then. But ultimately, I'd like to sort of think about and talk to you guys about this question of how much is Trump, and it's not the first time this question's been asked, but is Trump a symptom of like a deeper decay that's been happening? That maybe now, like in a fatal disease, it comes on late, and it's like, oh God, we're much sicker than we thought we were, or is he some sort of primal mover of this? My main like thing that irks me about most of the commentary is that I fundamentally feel that Trump is symptomatic, not causal. Now, for all these sorts of reasons, and I mean, so
it can be both and. I mean,
yes, for sure,
it can
and
be
he's an
both
accelerant.
symptomatic
Yeah.
and intensifying the crisis by his sheer talent, his sheer
Yes.
demagoguery, and his contempt for democratic processes, institutions, and norms. He is remarkable. I mean, to argue against myself, when I think of something like FDR, here we have someone possibly attempting a fourth term, tempted to pack the court, assumed vast powers that the presidency had never assumed before, had big majorities in the Congress. Now, he was an emergency president, so you had a certain number of precedents in there, and you can't really see 2016 as an emergency in the sense that the Great Depression was, and therefore I think there's less excuse. And there are also higher standards as the modern era has emerged in controlling presidents. Now, the truth, of course, though, is that in previous eras, the presidency was much less powerful than it is today. So I think you have several things working at once, all of which are very disturbing. So I think you have your average American not giving a shit about the rule of law, about congressional opposition, about whether you should agree to a subpoena. They just don't. There's nothing there. There's no education. There's no civic education. I've always seen this, and I still see it from the perspective of the ancient political philosophers, which is that this democracy is on the verge, and it's reached the point in late stage democracy in which tyrants will emerge. That one men, those charismatic figures, are the people who are going to be leading this institution. That Republican institutions, but small r, are really irrelevant. That you also see this, for example, in the decay and collapse of the Roman Republic, which is another fascinating example of this, where little precedents are set. Oh, well, this time we're going to let this happen. Okay, we'll do it this time. We'll allow that to happen. It wasn't that big a deal. Like, the Senate still exists. And then, boom, very quickly it unravels. I think American democracy and liberal democracy is in a death spiral. And I think you also see this in our debate. We don't have a very liberal space for argument and debate anymore. You also see that tribalizing to an extraordinary extent around this figure. So now, what do we do? To answer your question, Demir, I think Biden, whether by luck or design or chance or genius, has figured out by far the best way of doing this. And he won. The Democrats didn't really do that well. He managed to get there. Why? Hardly campaigning at all. I mean, never saying anything controversial. Essentially being, I'm the old guy, And I think the country thought, well, this president is obviously off his rocker. I mean, he says things every day that we know are untrue. I think even his supporters understand that. So let's just have this guy to sort of and if he just behaves that role, if he's this sort of figurehead and does things that are broadly popular, like a big stimulus, for example, some green investment, I think a public option, these things may be doable. He stands a chance of steadying the whole system, and he stands a chance of being a bit of a narcotic in an extremely fevered time. And so I think that's great. I wanted him to be the nominee from the get-go for those reasons. I don't think any other, and maybe I'm wrong about this, what you think, I don't think any other of those Democrats would have won this election. I don't.
Yeah.
And it's telling to me about the strength of the Democratic Party. It doesn't have someone who could have done that, except for this guy. This old guy.
But even then, we cut it pretty close. I mean, that night just about a month ago was pretty scary in that, it became clear that the margin was actually wider than we thought at that particular moment. But I think that I was in an election party, actually Demir was there too, where I think a lot of us were like, it really shouldn't be this close. The fact that there are 3 or 4 states where the margins are so slim, here's a uniquely polarizing and I would say shitty president, Donald Trump, and we have this much trouble beating him, which gets to the broader issue of, why are Democrats so weak or so uncompelling that we have so much trouble beating a party that's as rotten and corrupt as you're saying it is, right? That's one thing. But I want to push you a bit on the FDR comparison, because I do think Trump was an emergency president, at least for the last year, COVID being the emergency, but also we had unrest in major cities across the country. And this is where I think the argument that Trump was a dictator in the making is a little bit weaker, in that he had basically 2 contexts where he really could have really used the opportunity of chaos to seize power, to consolidate power, and to push really hard on COVID, unprecedented, and also on the protests, the Black Lives Matter protests that were happening throughout the country. And he actually abdicated responsibility. He said, I don't actually want to deal with a lot of this stuff. And he almost disappeared in some ways from the public scene. He would just sort of like not engage on these issues, and he would ignore COVID. He would threaten about sending troops in. He did send, agents in Portland and things like that. But for the most part, he left it up to states and localities to deal with their own issues. Now, that tells us something that in any other situation, any other dictator type person would have said, here is my opportunity. And Roz Douthat has really made this case quite a bit. I think it's pretty compelling. And so that's one. So he had his chance. Does that tell us something about the limits of this would-be authoritarianism? I'd just be curious how you would respond to that specific aspect. And now maybe it would have been better if you had a national approach, an aggressive approach to COVID. That's a different issue, which is interesting, that I think that in an ideal world, you some on the left might have wanted the president to really take control, but it's also be careful what you wish for. Would we really want Trump to be extremely involved on COVID response and try to interfere with what states are doing and apply some uniform approach? It's also so that's actually the blessings and the curse of our system, in some ways.
Yeah, I think Donald Trump is a really interesting character from this respect, because I think if you think of him, he's instinctually a tyrant. Like, he's not interested in, he just has no understanding of a non-zero sum engagement. Everything has to be him controlling everything. And yet, and him at the center of everything and the center of attention. It turns out that this guy, you can't really, it's too much work. He's also lazy. He's also interested in the glory, but not the power as much. And so, and it's hard to see what his real goal is to control anything except his own glory and fame, et cetera, et cetera. And so you don't have power mad people trying to control a vast apparatus of power watching cable news all day. There is this paradox of him, which is that he's not controlling things requires too much energy, discipline, concentration, focus, that he is simply incapable of. He represents, I think, the tyrannical id, not the tyrannical ego. And so he has this essentially tyrannical sense, but the system did require that to become truly dangerous, to have organization, to have management skills, to have people who can go out there and exactly do control things. What matters is that he was the successful president. That's what matters. And I agree with you. He didn't. My great fear back in 2016, or in a couple of years, was that I even wrote this back in May of 2016. There's an incident with a cop killing a young black man, and the place goes up in flames, and he takes that as an opportunity to enforce some sort of martial law or some kind of, and when push came to shove, he didn't. And I do think that's important, and I acknowledge that point. Absolutely. It doesn't mean that he wouldn't have liked to have done that. He didn't have the skills, but I think it's also true that even without the skills, that's just not in his. As long as he is free to do whatever the fuck he wants, and no one criticizes him, he's fine. To actually do what he wants, to actually execute it, is a much more difficult and complicated process. And I don't think he had that in him, which means we lucked out. But yeah, so I'm not gonna. And when you think about, as Ross has pointed out, when you think about the opportunity COVID would present, possible dictator. So he has this strange American kind of dictatorship, which I want to be the boss man. I'm the only boss man. Nothing else matters. But I don't actually want to enforce this everywhere because it would take far too much energy and concentration. And that's how I'm trying to understand this.
That makes sense.
But I'm also trying to understand from the way in which the system responded to this guy, and what he could have gotten away with if he'd had the skill set to do so. And the way in which an entire national party enabled and supported, and still is enabling and supporting, this person. I mean, Ted Cruz apparently is prepared to go to the Supreme Court to argue that, I don't know what bullshit he's going to argue, but and the fact that Republican senators can't say Biden won this election, is obviously disturbing. But I have to concede on that. My worst fears were not realized.
Okay.
And so, but is that because the system checked him, or because he just couldn't be bothered? That's what I think if he tried with majorities in both House and Senate, he could have done whatever the bloody hell he wanted.
So I mean, to be worried though, I mean, you bring up the classical example, and I think it's useful to think in those terms. But again, to think in those terms again to try and abstract Trump out of it. Do you think, again, I think it's overused when people talk about populism, about the elites being rotten, and that this is some kind of reaction against that. But to what extent do you think that the real parallel here is that I mean, America has been progressively been getting less and less aristocratic since its founding. Um, but the extent to which that there's a kind of hollowness there that again was sort of filled in, and that there was a desire there, again, not to cite my dear former professor Frank Fukuyama as some sort of proof that there was a desire for a loosening of the system to get things done before Trump even was a glimmer in anyone's eye. But it's visible there. I mean, I think Democrats are quite frustrated after Obama being stymied at every turn by again this kind of petty bickering of the elites. And sure, some of us chin strokers would say, well, this is systems designed to work slowly, and this is good, and the founders, the framers intended it this way. But there's an increasing sense, I think, among voters in general that the system wasn't working. It was gridlocked, and worse than that, staffed at the higher levels by careerist, shits. Pardon me. I don't know if you curse on your podcast, but
Fuck
that
no.
that um, and that something needed to change right here. Again, this is not an excuse I'm making for Trump voters. It's a hackneyed excuse. Something needed to change, but I think it is important to note that there's some kind of frustration, a kind of hollowness at the top. One way to look at this election and this close election is that dissatisfaction has not dissipated, and the trust in the last 4 years by the elites opposing Trump the crisis of Trump has not redounded to their benefit. They have not seized the opportunity to rebuild trust. In fact, they've squandered it and made it worse. However, the vast incompetence and flailing buffoonery of this orange troglodyte has also disqualified him, I think, in the face of a lot of voters. So what you have perhaps is a kind of split election. Half the country still doesn't believe, and this maybe partially explains why they're still so hell bent on doing this this whole thing that Biden didn't win. I'm not saying that this is some kind of false consciousness or even performative, but it is a big fu to the establishment as well. It's just like, I don't buy anything that's coming out of you. So half the country is still in that mode, and the other half of the country got a good look at what the fu looks like and got particularly worried. So perhaps that hasn't yet been worked out. Still, I think there's plenty to be worried about. Again, you're right that again, we've talked about this in this episode, right? That there's something special about Trump, about that charisma that allows you to create this kind of thing. And maybe that's not replicable, and maybe in 4 years he's too demented or debilitated to be able to pull it off. That's still possible is troubling. The flip side of that is, again, maybe Andrew, you can talk about in the classical example, is the hollowness of whatever the aristocratic element in society is. Call it the elites, whatever. It's gone.
Mhm.
It's the meritocratic thing has just created a bunch of hollow-chested men at top, and women, and it's
And
perhaps that's part of the problem.
this, of course, is part of the ancient understanding too of the elites in this situation. That once the democratic forces intensify, elites lose their legitimacy. And the other critical part is the elites are more interested, and this you get very much in Plato and Aristotle, in money. And that when push comes to shove, when the actual constitution and political institutions are at risk, they will say, well, at least I'm making money, will opt out in some ways of their responsibilities as elites in order to simply pursue profit. And you saw that throughout the Republican Party, among the Republican elites, a cynical acceptance of this because, after all, you've got the tax cuts. We've goosed this long recovery into another frenzy. And also regular people were doing really pretty well, and as before COVID hit. It turns out that I think that some of the policies that Trump did, and again, I'm not really interested in policies because they're always going to be different. It's about the constitutional framework I'm talking about. But if you look at the policies, I do actually think an attempt to restrain immigration as you pump the economy full of demand will help. And that is probably why you've seen significant shifts toward Trump from ethnic minorities, even even gays insofar as they measure gays anymore. Uh, uh, and so that's another thing. So I'm looking at all the advantages he had. I think COVID was a sort of deus ex machina in a way that came in here. I remember saying like over a year ago, what on earth is going to stop this guy getting reelected? And came to a conclusion that only an act of God would do it. And it turned out an act of God did show up in this
Fools,
hideous
drunks,
way.
in the United States of America, right? The Bismarck quote is correct again, and we're saved.
We got lucky.
By, yeah.
But it seems to me that the broader atmosphere here is not very propitious, and that we haven't resolved anything with this election, really, except we've removed the crazy person who may be more effective without power. I mean, what was fascinating about watching Trump the last 4 years is his ability to rail against the very government he's supposed to be running. That he's really strongest out of power, projecting power. And I think the ability of this mass movement, which to cripple the presidency of Biden, and to further spread. I mean, let us also remember that that some secretaries of state, have had their houses, their actual houses surrounded. You've seen also in terms of liberal norms and procedures in democracies, you've seen, for example, the fact that protests are no longer enough. You see the personalization of this. You see physical intimidation of public officials. You see people having to go into hiding for doing their constitutional duty. You see on the streets people doing things they never used to do in demonstrations, invade passers-by, eating in restaurants. Or you see among the elites demonizations, attempts to get people fired. These are not processes that happen in a liberal democracy. They're processes that happen in what is an incipient populist authoritarian kind of culture. It's not what we were used to.
But to be fair, I mean, we're not seeing mass unrest from Republican voters. Like, you might imagine that if 70% of Republicans and Trump supporters see the result as illegitimate, they would be taking to the streets and really getting angry. I think one plus side is that it seems that a lot of people, when they're asked by pollsters, they say, oh, we don't think, we're not sure if Biden won, or we think that the election was rigged. But they're not actually following that up with any kind of anti-system anger or mobilization. That's, I think, what a lot of people were fearing, that right-wing paramilitias, paramilitaries would be going around and terrorizing people. Yeah. We have seen very limited right-wing mobilization. And then you have to wonder how much of this is operating. Again, this is where I think narrative and rhetoric is one level of analysis. Then we have what actually happens on the ground. And I think I put a little bit less emphasis on the narrative because I feel like a lot of it ends up being intangible. So fine, 70% of Republicans have questions about how this election was conducted. They're kind of pissed off, but not really. Then what? They find a way to live with it and life moves on, and they're not going to actually be spending the next 4 years destroying democracy. They're going to live with a Biden presidency, just as Democrats I don't think they did a great job of living with a Trump presidency, but, Trump continued being president. Life went on. So I just wonder, like, when we're really afraid, what does that actually mean on the ground if Trump supporters aren't actually mobilizing? Because, I mean, also after 2000, there were, many Democrats who didn't really consider the election to be free and fair. So this is not a brand new thing. I mean, for a while now, whenever the other party wins, there's going to be a group of people who feel disenfranchised. But then, so I'm.
Yeah, except that you would expect more than 26 Democrats after the election last time to agree that Trump won the election.
Yeah.
And, you did have Obama inviting Trump in a couple of days later. You had Hillary conceding the next day. You had that. You had a recognition, at least, that this was. But look, I'm open to that debate. And part of me wonders whether I'm just read too much political theory. I've focused on how liberal democracies fail too much, that I'm in my head too much, that I'm online too much, that the narratives competing in my head are actually too fevered for reality in America. And so then you get to this point, and I take your point. We haven't, the country is not collapsing in mass anger and fury. Although quite how COVID is related to that, who knows? But so therefore the question becomes for someone like me or you is, so do we poo-poo this, or are we the people whose job it is to warn and to throw up flares? Now we all have different roles,
Yeah.
and I think our key thing is to tell the truth so far as we can. And we don't know what's happening. There's a huge amount of just not knowing how the country is, and we're gleaning exit polls, we're gleaning from. So maybe you're right. And if you were living your life in a small town somewhere, and you didn't really take much interest in politics, you noticed people were getting a little steamed up and crazy, and this dude came in, and you were doing fine until this bloody plague came on, blah, 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 blah. And, life goes on, and what the hell are you all talking about? If I had just gone offline 4 years ago. But then I wonder, well, wasn't that also happening in other countries which actually were tipping into real crises? Is that not going to always be the view of the regular person? Is it not our job to notice when some serious bloody problems are emerging, and especially when the American people are not that invested in their system? They are pretty invested in sort of venting. And the other thing I worry about is just, again, the two different worlds we're living in which very, very hard for there to be any kind of compromise or single national response when we're really in different universes of reality, in a way that I don't think was necessarily as true in much of the 20th century, and probably wasn't true for much of the 19th either, except for, the period before the Civil War, when these realities really did diverge as to what America was. So, yeah, I hope we maneuver through this somehow. I hope we muddle through. In that sense, I am a conservative, and I think this stuff, we shouldn't be overly panicked. And we maybe need more time just to get more perspective on this. Damir, sorry.
What's the role, do you think, of writers and intellectuals? Could Weimar have, and again, all caveats aside, we're not Weimar, we're mature democracy, etc. Could it have been saved with a handful of people pointing out exactly what was going on, or were these forces bigger than that? Again, that's ultimately where I'm coming from on this, and this is why most of my writing and analysis ends up sort of, I think, it's not poo-pooing the worried people. I'm plenty worried. I'm just worried in a very different register. And I think that there's a kind of complacency, a weird complacency that comes from feeling that you're on the right side of a fight rather than just part of a system that's rotting. Now, I'm not saying that my analysis gets us any closer to a solution, but I think it's a more correct analysis because it abstracts myself from partly from what's the rot that's happening. Maybe that's vanity. It certainly is vanity, but I think that, like, maybe that should be the role of us as we analyze this, is to step even a little bit further behind, outside of it, to say, let's look at the bigger picture of how things are going wrong. While perhaps maybe the conservative optimists' take is to say that, well, it's worked this long. There's clearly some kind of genius in the founding of this country and how the institutions were set up, as ramshackled as it seems sometimes, as out of step with the times as it seems, as sclerotic at times it seems. It's worked this long. Maybe there's some level of optimism and trust we should get, some positive feeling we should have that we'll muddle through. Again, Bismarck, his quote about God and fools and drunks in the United States. Maybe that's the optimistic case, but I think that the analyst's role, as I see it in any case, is to try and as much as possible get as wide and big a picture, as historically grounded a picture as possible. Not that history repeats itself, not that we're Weimar, not that we're late Rome in any one way necessarily in a one-to-one thing, but I wonder whether the part of the problem with the sort of simpler analyses is that we miss the bigger thing. Not saying that knowing the bigger thing helps us necessarily cope with it, but I kind of think that it might. I don't know.
In other words,
Does that make
understanding
sense?
oneself is completely irrelevant to the situation is by far the best register with which to understand and write about. I see the merits of that, Shadi. How do you see? I'm just temperamentally at war with that, and I understand that's my temperament more than anything else. I'm just a little too passionate by nature, I think. I get upset too easily. And I calm down, but I guess I'm just thinking now about our role and what we do and how we understand that. Yeah, it is to understand things better, but also to be engagé, as it were. But I mean engagé not in I mean more in a Camus than a Sartre kind of way, if you see what I mean. I mean, you probably do see what I mean, but there's an element of insufficiency to the sort of rather dry analytic mode. I think there is a really important role for that, and I think we probably have less of that than we need, and we have more firing off than we need to. And I think obviously maybe social media has made all of this much, much worse. And that has distorted our understanding of what's happening. Shadi,
Yeah, I mean, what I'm struck by is when I talk to people who aren't on Twitter, sometimes they're not even aware of the debates that those of us who are online are having, that it's almost like I'm entering into a parallel universe. Like, for example, my mom is completely unaware of what wokeism is. And she's asked me several times, like, Shadi, on your podcast, you talk about woke. I just don't really understand it because in her real life, it's not like a real thing to her. And similarly, I don't think she's aware of all the election fraud, Republicans doing all this craziness and trying to resist. And she just she knows that Trump has refused to concede, but it doesn't occur to her that Biden becoming president is not going to happen, or that there's a real challenge or any real chance of it not going the way it's supposed to go. So I feel like if you're in a space that she's in, which I think a lot of Americans who are, they're aware of politics, but they're not very engaged, and they just are operating in a very different context. Because when I go on Twitter and I see people, like, she wasn't aware that there were a bunch of people who thought that Trump was staging a coup. But if you were on Twitter the week after the election, half of the people I was following literally seemed to believe that we were on the verge of a fascist coup happening any moment. And I'm not being hyperbolic. That's actually the language they would use: fascist or coup or a combination thereof. So, and this kind of makes me think about, Ross Douthat's argument in The Decadent Society that Americans like play acting. They like this performative back and forth. And even woke, I mean, as we both think that wokeism, part of the reason it's so problematic is that it's about performative outrage and it's detached from real lives as they're actually lived. But you wonder sometimes that if people are spending all this time play acting, that also, it pushes them away from actually doing really bad things in the real world. And maybe in some ways, that's like a somewhat optimistic way of looking at it. Can you imagine if all these crazy people would, not crazy, but like some of
Yeah, it's
them are
crazy.
crazy, but also people who suffer from legitimate mental illness. And this is not something to be joked about. Like people who already have these issues, the COVID exacerbates it. They're on their computer all the time and they're spending all their time freaking out. And, maybe that's a way to get it out of one system. And that's better than the alternative of people actually expressing their anger in actual everyday politics. And this leads to this kind of endless back and forth of online performance between different factions. But a lot of it's just decadent. It's this endless repetition of exaggerated arguments, and none of it is actually based in the real world as we know it. I mean, that's one maybe slightly more optimistic way of looking at it, is that yeah, I mean, is Twitter, I mean, this is the endless debate. To what extent is our online life a real life?
Right. To what extent? But then I would take an example like climate change, where there is an online debate, as it were, and there are people dug in on and denying it and supporting it. It does have an effect on policy in the end. I think of my own family, and my mom has she's English, but they're saturated with American coverage. That's the weird thing. The whole world has been watching this in a sort of, in a way that I still find remarkable. My mother's position is, well, he's obviously just a loony.
Yeah.
Basically, that's it. And part of it's like, my mom is basically right. That we just had this slightly deranged person in office who doesn't have really a good sense of reality, and now he's gone. And don't make such big fuss about it. And my brother's position is that too. But then I look at my brother, who has, thanks to COVID and other things, just does nothing but listen to podcasts from Joe Rogan to Jordan Peterson that is jumping down rabbit holes and becoming radicalized in a way that, he's probably going to hear this and be mad at me, but in which I joked to him about it. Like, what's happening to you? You used to be such a even-tempered kind of, pretty sorted out dude, and now you're frothing at the mouth. You're a men's rights activist, all this stuff that eventually comes out. Now, look, there are reasons for that. He has arguments. It's not like and some of the arguments are really worth listening to. But I don't think it's entirely cosplay. I don't think it's entirely. It has to affect you. It has to affect the way you think about the world, and therefore the way you vote. And it is a problem. The inability to agree on a shared set of facts is a problem. I don't mean to sound banal about it, but it kind of is, right? And we have an epidemic in this country, which is obviously, talk about reality. And yet we do have large sections of the society just refusing to acknowledge this reality because it's not in their political or cultural worldview to accept it.
But I guess it raises the question. Why do people across the political spectrum, they seem to be lacking meaning in some kind of fundamental way, where instead they want to replace that with this constant supply of anger, outrage, and there's a kind of thrill to finding enemies and searching them out. And I think there's a sort of a bigger foundational question: why in this particular moment, and not just in the U.S., because we see the rise of right-wing populists throughout the world in very different cultures and societies, there is something happening.
Also among our peers on the left.
Yeah, sure.
This summer I was like, what happened to you? It's like the invasion of the body snatchers. Suddenly everybody is in this frantic notion that we have a crisis of white supremacy right now everywhere in the air, and and we have to confront it now, and why aren't you? And these are feverish emotions that are widespread. At the same time, I notice everybody's trying to do meditation and yoga. They're attempting to find some balance,
and it's not working. And maybe they'd be better off finding a traditional religion.
Well, Shadi, you and I agree on this. I also believe actually that you can't understand what's happened in terms of our culture, or in terms of things like the opioid crisis, which is another massive reality that we sort of look away from half the time, without understanding what's happened to people's souls and minds, without the simple rituals and practices of a religion that do connect you with existential things, that keep you with some perspective, understand your own mortality, and get some grip on who you are, and some sort of sense of where you are. Just by if you don't have the stars above you, how on earth do you know what direction you're going in? And most people are in very cloudy, dark situations now, and this stuff replaces the needs, the fundamental human needs that religion used to help supply. And one of the big questions I have, and this is another podcast, Johnny, but is, can liberal democracy survive the collapse of Christianity? If for example, I think of wokeism, the conception of humans as simply parts of these ethnic groups or oppressive groups. The one thing that used to be a solvent to that was the Christian understanding in the West, that we're all equal in the eyes of God. We're all individual souls. that are judged individually by God and by ourselves, and that we have inherent dignity, which means that we can't be simply put into these massive identity blocks, that we're much more complicated than that. But once you remove that premise, which of course liberalism sprung out of in a way in the West, and I think it tempered it in the West in a way that was very helpful, not without huge conflicts and dramas and all the rest of it. But I think without that, we are in trouble. And for that reason, I find the inability to go to church to be a big deal right now.
Yeah.
It's these religious freedom cases. But look, I can't risk going into a church. I just can't for mass. I mean, you can probably hear in the podcast, my lungs are not that great. I don't think I'd do very well if I got this bloody disease. But I feel, the toll of not having that space, that moment of the week where I take stock and just get out of myself for a bit. And I do think that's a problem, and it probably has been more so because of COVID. We're all stuck at home, nothing to do. Demio, you were about. I could see in your face you were about to say something.
Yeah, no. So I'm very sympathetic to the argument, but let me just throw it again at you more than Shadi, Andrew, because I think you could maybe give a little bit perspective on this. I mean, it's telling also that wokeism is an American phenomenon that's leaked out into the rest of the West, and the counter to at least part of your both, I think, your shared analyses about the role of religion is in fact the deeply secularized European continent, which for whatever reason hasn't yet been racked, though it is also experiencing this populist stuff. Arguably Orbanism and the Polish, law and justice thing is more rooted in traditionalism than Trump ever was. Though I guess the impulse is again this kind of rejection of some kind of feckless elites that drives it. But again, back to the question of that the God-shaped hole you guys are talking about and liberal democracy existing within it. I don't know, Andrew. Arguably, outside of the United States, which has always been much more religious than Europe, liberal democracy, well, again, under very specific circumstances of the Cold War, and the Cold War certainly provided a certain kind of framework for how to at least orient yourself, even on the continent. It worked, and yet now it's in some kind of tumult. So I don't know. Does that complicate your analysis at all?
America has always had this religious spirit at its center. We should do a 1620 project in which we talk about the influence of the first religious fanatics to come and found America, which in some ways tells just as vivid a story as other historical starting dates. Well, good question. I grew up in England, probably the most secular place around. I mean, commonsensical. Even when they created Christianity, it was barely that. I remember an old Oxford professor of mine said he was. I'm just trying to remember this quote exactly. We can probably. He was talking about he was a member of the Church of England because he needed to take a stand against religion.
That's good.
That was he was an atheist, but solidly Anglican because of that. It was by far the least problematic. And there was always a way in which the English did that. I remember an old high Tory friend of mine, old guy, who I remember on Easter once, who said, "Hallelujah, the Lord is risen, have a drink." And this sort of, did he believe the Lord had actually risen? I'm an Irish Catholic kid. I'm not English in that way. I come from a very different culture, and I really kind of disliked it because I think they sort of, something's died inside in Europe. I hate to say that, but it feels empty. And then I'd also feel that Europe is much more indicative of what, Frank Fukuyama would call or Nietzsche would call the last men. They really do feel like shadows. of human beings culturally, and it may be that Islam will save them all some way. It doesn't look like Anglicanism is going to do it. But I go back to England, and the whole place is as polarized as anything over here. The anger, the frustration, the mutual incomprehension from two parts of society, which it's came to be symbolized over Brexit, which even now we're on the verge of some kind of resolution or not. And when you actually look at the resolution, it's about fishing and about subsidizing industries. Now, these are not things that in other contexts people would feel this strongly about. Bringing down governments, bringing down prime ministers, tearing the country apart. So there is something going on here. And it is about, I think, some sort of sense that you're in control and not completely at the behest of forces that somehow these bureaucrats seem to understand, or these technocratic elites seem to be fine with, but you don't understand, and it's hurting you in ways that's destroying your livelihood or changing your neighborhood in ways that you don't particularly like. So I don't think I don't think that Europe's escaped this, even though it too isn't suffering really from a loss of religion in the 21st century, in the way that America is. So I don't know.
But one possibility is that our natural state is something like this, where we as citizens don't agree on foundational questions, that our divides are existential. They're no longer about policy. And maybe we were able to delude ourselves as Americans, or at least during the end of the Cold War and thereafter in the 90s, that wasn't, that's not real, in the sense that we're going back to our natural state of disagreeing on big questions, because human beings disagree on their conception of the good life. They have different comprehensive doctrines. And we were spoiled for a little while where we thought we could transcend that. And now in all of these different societies, and to me, this was very striking because, spending time in the Middle East during the Arab Spring, for example, I was struck by how like people wouldn't debate policy, taxes, healthcare. That wasn't what politics was about. It was about the meaning of the nation state, the role of religion in public life, and that's what divided people. And I used to think then that America was different because we talked about policy, and like that's when healthcare was still the big issue under Obama. But now we're in some sense almost in a way catching up to the way the Middle East was then. And I thought that, Americans, like we agree on the foundations, and this goes to 1619 and all that. We're realizing more and more that foundational questions are up for grabs.
Yeah.
And maybe that's just something we're going to have to live with our fellow Americans on, that there's no way for one side to conclusively convince or defeat the other side on this. And we're going to have to sort of coexist with different foundational premises. Then the question becomes, how do we live together, not in spite of that, but like taking into account that difference is real and it's lasting. So I think that's sort of like increasingly how I'm looking at these questions. We can't undo this kind of lack of consensus. So when people say, we have to find a way to build back consensus, we have to find a way to be unified again, we're not going to be unified again.
Yeah, but liberalism was supposed to solve that, right? That was the problem. That's why liberalism was created. Now, when liberalism is itself part of that process, you really do come back to the sort of Straussian critique of liberal democracy, that really it's got a very empty center and it's a very shallow form, and that maybe it was sustained by effortless prosperity and bullshit. But the notion, for example, that who comes in and out of your country, who is an American or non-American, is not something that we should debate politically, which was really the consensus for a long time. We don't debate immigration levels. We don't, even though the country is being bloody transformed by it. We're not talking about that. And to some extent, this was an insistence by a lot of people that, hold on a minute, we do want to talk about that. It's pissing us off or unnerving us, and we want something to change. So maybe this is helpful.
That's the hollow elites, though, right? I mean, that specifically is that they're beholden to that ideology, that kind of thing, that it doesn't exist, that the nation state doesn't exist, and it's ideological there. I mean, in that sense, I mean,
I've been shocked, to be honest. I'm really shocked by my peers. I had no idea they didn't really believe in the nation state. I had no idea they didn't really believe in liberal individualism, that they were basically racial identitarians. And when they looked at me, the most important thing is that I'm white and male and cis.
But are they, or is it something, is it a bit of cowardice as well, that they don't actually feel that strongly, but this is where the wind is blowing and it's too hard to resist, especially if you're a white male, to kind of, to fight against wokeism is risky. I can get away with a lot because I'm brown and Muslim and I'm one of the disadvantaged groups in the hierarchy, great. But if you're a white person, you feel like you better get with the program.
Yeah.
Right?
Unless you're like me and you're just,
but it takes
fucking way I'm going to have to agree to this bullshit.
But that takes conviction in it, and
it does, yes, and in my case probably an undeserved, but because I don't, I can always find my readers. I can always earn a living. I've had to earn a living outside of these structures because otherwise I wouldn't have one. Well, we've been talking for a very long time about so many things, and I think we got into some really interesting territory that maybe we should explore another time, especially religion and politics, which I know you and I both care deeply about. I think we have some differences about that, and also about maybe, Shadi, you and I don't know, Damir, what your religious status is, or it's one of the things I don't ask.
Degenerate European in that
you're
sense,
a dead person. Your soul has withered and died, gone away.
Right.
You're a shadow.
A wraith.
But one thing I think we don't talk about enough, Shadi, which maybe we should, is what it is like for actual people. I hate this terminology because it just makes me vomit. But people of faith, it's how we navigate modernity in this way, and how we. I mean, I'm also really shocked at how many white Catholics voted for Trump. It's a very difficult thing for me to process.
I'm shocked at how many Muslims voted for Trump.
Well, yeah.
And the increase seems to be quite significant. I mean, some numbers are coming out as many as 35% of American Muslims voted for Trump, where last time around it was around 10 to 15%. Still a minority, but that's a pretty big increase. And you have to ask yourself, 4 years of Trump, Muslims were like, we want more of this.
Yes, fuck yeah. Also true of, we don't have it. I mean, we only have data now of this awful rubric called LGBTQ. I don't know what the hell that means. I mean, 20% of under 30s identify as that. Well, that can't mean they're all lesbian.
Oh, it's that high now?
It's gotten that high, yeah. It just means it just means cool at this point. So 22% of cool people, but nonetheless, even amongst that broad and meaningless category, there's been an increase in support for Trump since 2016 amongst the whatever they are. So yeah, it's worth thinking about. I found that much easier to explain, to be honest, because there are many diverse ideas among gays and lesbians, and they're not Catholics. They're not supposed to be committed to the dignity of human beings. They're not supposed to be committed to the virtues of poverty or selflessness and all the things that Trump despises and opposes. But that's also what's interesting about religion. I mean, the evangelical embrace of this guy is truly, I mean, one of the things that I think one just has to begin to absorb more deeply over time, because they have embraced the antithesis of Christianity. I mean, virtually someone who represents the very dynamic opposite of Christianity as their savior. Now, that is an extraordinary phenomenon. I mean, someone who would literally heckle the Sermon on the Mount. And yet that's happened. And I think that also tells you that what I actually believe, which is that there's no place where Christianity is more dead than among political evangelicals. That it's just, they think that's what it is. It sure isn't. Anyway, we've had a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much. and thank you for having me on your podcast, and
Likewise.
vice
Thanks for having
versa.
us, Andrew. Yeah.
This is fun. Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
Oh yeah, it's this may be a good era for podding, because we are able to actually also humanize this a little bit. I mean, one thing that when I talk about my peers, what shocks me is how they express themselves on social media, and in some ways, just how much hate there is for an individual like me, or apparent hate. Maybe it's performative hate. I don't know. And some of these notions, like the not believing in the nation state, not even believing in a distinction between a citizen and a non-citizen, these are really kind of amazing things to me that I never really realized were that deep.
But they probably wouldn't hate you if they met you in person, right?
I hope not. I mean, I think I'm a relatively personable. I mean, I think one of the great things about the podcast is that people who have these weird ideas about who you are, this fucking maniac in a Ku Klux Klan robe, running around believing in the inferiority of various racial groups, which is fucking ridiculous. I don't believe any of that. Never believed any of that.